All right, welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series. I am Cliff Smith, the Washington Project Director of the Middle East Forum, and I am here to introduce our guest today, Alireza Nader, and he is from the National Union for Democracy in Iran, or NUFDI, has a very impressive background. He is also a senior fellow at the FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, as well as a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation. He has testified before the government and Congress. He has lectured at George Washington University in the Department of Defense and holds a BA from UC Santa Barbara and an MA from the George Washington University. Basically, what we're faced with now is for many months we have had huge protests in Iran. But despite less international coverage, Iranians continue to challenge the Islamist regime in Iran through strikes, civil disobedience, other local neighborhood groups doing acts of civil disobedience and other things, and these are being supported by Iranians abroad. But what comes next? What direction is it taking? What are the major challenges? What role do outside Iranians play? These are the kinds of questions that Mr. Nader can discuss for us. So please, Mr. Nader, go ahead. Glad to have you.
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the invitation from the Middle East Forum. As you mentioned, Iranians have been going into the streets and resisting the Islamic Republic in other ways since Mahsa Amini was murdered by the regime in September. But this revolution in Iran, I call it a revolution because it's much more than a protest movement. This revolution against the Islamic Republic started more than 6 years ago. The first wave of protests against the regime that were called Barandas protests or overthrow protests started at the end of 2017. And from 2017 on to this day, there have been, by my count, 7 major uprisings against the Islamic Republic, including the massive 2019 uprising, the Aban uprising against the regime, which was brutally crushed with thousands of people killed by the Islamic Republic. Since September of this year, we've seen mass demonstrations on the streets of not just Tehran, the capital, but every other major city, town, and even the smallest of villages with a few hundred people have had major demonstrations against the regime. Because of the regime's brutality, in reaction to these demonstrations, the mass demonstrations have abated. The regime has been executing young prisoners, shooting young women and men in the eye during the demonstrations, committing horrific acts of torture. And so it is no surprise that the revolutionaries in Iran, most of them who are very young, have decided to pursue other means of resistance against the regime. So for example, the streets of Tehran today, you see countless women refusing to wear the compulsory hijab or the draconian dress code imposed on women and men by the Islamic Republic. And the images are just amazing. You even see women going without the hijab next to police cars and regime security agents. And though they are challenged at times and harassed and beaten and arrested, I see that the security forces are much more afraid to challenge these violations of the compulsory hijab. Iranians have also been resisting the Islamic Republic in other ways. Thousands of them have been gathering at historic pre-Islamic national sites like the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargada. Cyrus the Great has become a major symbol of the national resistance to the Islamic Republic. His birthday has been celebrated for years with Iranians gathering around his tomb. The regime has prevented Iranians from doing so, but countless Iranians still visit his tomb. And now we see pictures of Iranian women without the hijab posing with their backs, of course, to the camera because they don't want to be identified. In addition to celebrating Iran's pre-Islamic past by gathering at these sites, Iranians have also used national holidays, most of them Zoroastrian in origin, to challenge the regime. So for example, the Wednesday before Nowruz, the Persian New Year, is called Charshanbe Suri, or Scarlet Wednesday. And Iranians came out against the regime and demonstrated during Charshanbe Suri, and again during Nowruz, the first day of the spring, the most important Iranian holiday, and Sizdeh Bedar, which is the 13th day of the year, another major holiday. Iranians have also been gathering at the resting places of very famous and revered Iranian poets like Hafez, Sadi, and Ferdowsi. There was one really not just a demonstration, but a celebration at the Hafeziyeh or Hafez's tomb in Shiraz that just really amazed me. There were thousands of people gathered around the Hafeziyeh, singing, dancing, with fireworks shooting off. And again, the regime did not interfere with these celebrations. There are credible reports that the security forces, especially the Revolutionary Guards, are demoralized and dissatisfied with the Islamic Republic's response to these protests. The Revolutionary Guards and the Basij paramilitary forces have really some inhumane and violent people working for them, people who are very ideologically committed to the Islamic Republic, and specifically Ayatollah Khamenei, the dictator in Iran. But there are Revolutionary Guards forces that don't like what's happening in Iran. They do not approve of Khamenei's actions. They don't believe that his son Mujtaba should succeed him. And I have no doubt that there are forces and individuals within the guards and the security forces overall that want actually the Islamic Republic gone. They can't be public about it. At the same time, it appears to the outside world that the revolution in Iran has abated. If you're not following events in Iran carefully, if you're not watching Persian language TV channels like Manato TV, or paying attention to social media, it's easy to conclude based on the scant English language coverage of Iran that this revolution has abated, but I don't see that at all. When you talk to people in Iran and outside of Iran, there's a high expectation that the Islamic Republic will eventually be overthrown. We can't predict how and when. It will take a lot more to get rid of this regime. It's extremely violent and has still a committed minority of followers willing to commit acts of violence. But I have no doubt that this regime is on its way out. Unfortunately, international support for the revolution in Iran has been quite lacking, and the US response under the Biden administration has been quite abysmal.
Given the Biden administration's lack of a response or lack of a helpful response, do you believe that has there been other supporters of the people in Iran that have allowed them to continue and given them hope?
There has been some movement from the European countries. There is a lot of pressure coming from the Iranian diaspora and its allies in Europe for European powers to prescribe the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. There have been mass protests in various European cities, including Brussels, Strasbourg, Paris, Berlin. And on the positive side, there has been a shift of the European view toward the Islamic Republic, especially as the entire world sees the failure of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the nuclear agreement as a policy. So the Europeans have been exploring other options, but unfortunately, there are reports that the United Kingdom refuses to prescribe the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. This is a major hurdle, and also Germany as well. I've heard that the French government is more amenable on the position of prescribing the Revolutionary Guards and overall of viewing the Islamic Republic as a major threat instead of a regime that should be appeased. But we're not there yet. I don't think the European Union and individual European countries have taken enough action. The Biden administration, unfortunately, has offered little beyond rhetoric. There is still hope, I believe, among senior officials of the Obama administration, the Biden administration, that the Islamic Republic will rejoin the JCPOA. And despite saying that human rights should be a major part of US foreign policy, the Biden administration has acted very much in the opposite direction. It has not prioritized human rights in Iran. It does not care about the struggle for freedom by the woman of Iran. And this is a woman-led revolution to free the woman of Iran and all of Iranian society from a brutal dictatorship. But again, the Biden administration has just offered lip service, unfortunately. The Iranian American community has been very active in advocating for the MASA Act in Congress. If the MASA Act becomes legislation, it asks that the Biden administration designate the dictator in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the president, Ebrahim Raisi, who is responsible for thousands of executions of innocent Iranians. It enables the Biden administration to sanction these individuals directly. What's interesting about the MASA Act is that it has bipartisan support from both Republicans and many Democrats, and can't really think of another foreign policy issue that has this much bipartisan support in Congress, especially given the hyper-partisan nature of American politics today. So I think the Iranian American community should be really commended for its actions, and the allies of the Iranian American community. One country I think that has been helpful is Israel. When it comes to Iran, I think the Israeli government understands what's happening in Iran, realizes the importance of this revolution, knows that Iranians are trying their hardest to get rid of this regime, and that the downfall of this regime would benefit not just the people of Iran, but the entire Middle East and the entire globe. This is a regime that is a threat to all. I mean, look what this regime is doing in Ukraine. It's providing drones to Putin's Russia. It's actively combating European interests in Eastern Europe. It is still targeting Americans for assassination and terrorism. So the JCPOA is not the answer to this problem. The answer to the problem that the Islamic Republic presents is the overthrow of this regime and its replacement by a secular democracy supported by the majority of the people of Iran.
One last question before we get to our audience questions. Do you think is the reluctance in Europe to do more of the things you mentioned, is it country to country specific, their reluctance, or is it a more general resistance to doing anything in Europe, and why?
The main hurdle is Joseph Borrell, the European official responsible for the nuclear portfolio. He is close to senior U.S. officials such as the U.S. envoy for Iran, Robert Malley. And Borrell insists, contrary to all evidence, that the nuclear issue in Iran and the nuclear program can be stopped through the nuclear agreement. Now, if you look at the JCPOA, major parts of the JCPOA have already expired. This is an agreement that was forged in 2017, a long time ago. A lot has changed, not just in Iran, but globally since then. And officials like Borrell, and they're not just him, but other European officials as well, I believe, either don't want the revolution in Iran to succeed or don't believe that it will succeed. And I think this is a very wrong-headed viewpoint. But it's not just European Union officials. The United Kingdom has also refused to proscribe the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. There is an Iranian gentleman who has gone on a hunger strike, Vahid Beheshti, to protest the United Kingdom's action or lack of action. He is in dire health. I actually do really worry about his health. He does not look good. But the British government has decided to ignore this issue. And the German government as well doesn't seem too keen on prescribing the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. Again, it's the reason for it could be that they do not fully understand the nature of the revolution in Iran, or they may not want it to succeed. A lot of these European governments have a decades-long history of appeasing the Islamic Republic. If you just look at the regime's history of assassinations on European soil and acts of terrorism on European soil, you see that these European governments have barely taken any action. They've let regime agents and assassins operate freely. They have not closed so-called religious centers. For example, in Germany, there are multiple so-called Islamic centers run by the Islamic Republic that are involved in acts of terrorism. There was recently a shooting at a synagogue in Germany, I believe in Berlin, with the Revolutionary Guards behind it. So we have to ask why these European governments are not taking action. I think their behavior is really disappointing because eventually the national revolution in Iran will win and the Islamic Republic will be gone. And these governments, not just in Europe, but the United States government, the Biden administration, should consider its relations with the future political system in Iran, where the people are sovereign. And the people of Iran have a long memory, and they will remember who stood by them in their hour of need and who turned their backs against them.
We're getting to audience questions now. There's a number in our queue already. If you have a question to ask, go ahead and type it on in. Let's start with one a few people have asked some version of, and that is basically the continued protests against the government. Is there a leader to this movement? Is there more than one? How does that dynamic work out?
I'm glad that question was asked because that's something I wanted to cover. So the revolution itself has been led by mostly young people on the streets. There are groups called neighborhood committees that are organizing and leading not just demonstrations, but acts of resistance. So for example, setting fire to banners of Khamenei and Qasem Soleimani, or attacking and burning down Basij headquarters. I've seen a lot of these actions in the past few months. So the revolution is very much localized. People in Iran have been organizing for it since the 2017 uprising. A lot of this is not publicly seen because, of course, the local leadership does not want to be identified. But there are also many human rights defenders and political activists who are involved and have been imprisoned in Evin. Some very, very brave people like Fatemeh Sepehi, a religious woman who wears the chador, but is adamantly against the Islamic Republic, or Manucher Bakhtiar, whose son Puya was killed in 2019. He's a true patriot who's in jail and suffering greatly. Outside of Iran, based on everything I've seen, the most popular leader is the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. He has a huge following in Iran. Many demonstrations since 2017 have called out the Pahlavi name and have called for his return. And I think Pahlavi has been very successful in not just gaining the support of course, constitutional monarchists, which I think is, based on my analysis and observations, that probably the most influential and organized revolutionary movement in Iran. So Pahlavi has not only been able to gather the support of the constitutional monarchists, which is natural, but he has emerged as the opposition leader amongst all sorts of Iranians. So personally, I know many Iranians, both inside of Iran and outside of Iran, because I do talk to a lot of Iranians inside of Iran who don't necessarily believe in a constitutional monarchy. They may prefer a parliamentary republic, but they still support Reza Pahlavi as the figurehead leader of this revolution. And he was just in Europe. He had a number of really historic meetings. He spoke at the Munich Security Conference, which is very important symbolically because the Munich Conference was always dominated by the Islamic Republic. Figures like the former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif spoke at Munich. So it was important to see the Crown Prince along with other prominent activists gather at the Munich conference. And he also spoke at Oxford. And I think his presence in Oxford was very telling for me because hundreds of people gathered around him and really just mobbed him. And I think that's a fraction of his support. If you look at the major protests in LA, I think about 3 months ago, where 80,000 people, an estimated 80,000 people showed up. Many of those people showed up to hear Reza Pahlavi speak. But when we look at the Iranian opposition overall, I've never seen so much unity. It's really unprecedented in the last 44 years, where so many Iranians have decided to put aside their differences, whether those differences are political or personal, to unite around the goal of getting rid of the Islamic Republic. And despite the regime's efforts to sabotage this movement, and I see a lot of regime activity on social media these days, trying to divide us. Despite these regime attempts, opposition in Iran is very united because the common goal is to get rid of the Islamic Republic, for the people of Iran to hold a referendum where they choose their own political system, whatever political system they choose. I think Iranians want a secular democracy, representative democracy. So the vast majority of Iranians, with the exception of the Islamic Republic and groups like the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, and the ethnic separatists, the vast majority of Iranians are united around these goals of overthrowing the regime.
Mirdad Kansari, a former diplomat in the old regime before the Islamic Revolution, asks, starting tomorrow, the regime in Iran is introducing the enforcement of a number of draconian measures to enforce mandatory hijab. What, in your view, could be done to help protesters resist these measures that go beyond mere physical contact and is concentrated more on making everyday life more difficult?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the regime has set up cameras all over Iran to monitor women and record on them. It has really advanced and very creepy technologies that allow it to identify women who are not wearing the hijab and then send text to them warning them. Women are still being attacked physically and imprisoned and tortured for trying to really exercise their natural personal choice. I think the world community really needs to pay attention to this issue. There has not been enough coverage, English language media coverage of the human rights violations in Iran. For example, in the past several months, thousands of school children, especially young girls, have been poisoned, I believe, by the Islamic Republic. There's no way that these poisonings across more than 300 schools could have happened without the active knowledge and involvement of the Islamic Republic. Yet I see that there's been scant media coverage of this issue. The US government has not paid any attention to it. I cannot recall any US government official talk about the school poisonings. So I think just general awareness is important, and letting elected officials know about what's going on in Iran and pressuring them to do something about it. I think the MASA Act is a very good starting point. The more members of Congress support and co-sponsor this act, the better. And I think the public's pressure in the United States has played an important role, but we need more of it. We need more local and national news coverage of what's happening in Iran. I feel like the world is beginning to forget about the struggle for freedom in Iran, and we can't let the people of Iran down like that. We need to keep reminding everybody about what's happening in Iran, because this revolution is very much alive. And I believe in the next few months, we're going to see more demonstrations and greater acts of resistance against this regime as it becomes weaker every day.
Hulda Fahmy asks, are any updates regarding the poison attacks in the girls' school in Iran? Are those attacks ongoing?
Yes, those attacks are ongoing. More than 300 schools have been poisoned. It could be actually much greater than that. In all sorts of cities and towns, large and small, from Tehran to Sanandaj in the west. And the school poisonings are really a warning to the women of Iran, because in the early months of the national revolution, a lot of the people driving the demonstrations were young women, high school students. I personally seen dozens, if not hundreds, of videos of girls tearing up pictures of Khomeini and Khamenei in their schools and leading demonstrations. and they're joined by their teachers and their parents. And the regime is very much afraid of these young women. These are the people who are trying to get rid of this regime, and they've captured the world's attention. So the school poisonings are a way of deterring further protests. And I can't really think of any other system of government on this earth who does this to its own population. It's just really horrific what's happening. And it just saddens me that not enough attention is being paid to it.
One last question before we go. Benjamin Baird asks, should we take in good faith the known and suspected Iran regime proxies who now say they support regime change?
I'm not sure which regime proxies they are. Of course, the Islamic Republic has created a very wide network of supporters, if that's what you mean by proxies. Yes, there is an Islamic Republic lobby in the United States. It's been very active for years. The groups and individuals' names. They have helped officials like Javad Zarif cover up this regime. They've hidden this regime's crimes against humanity under the defense of the JCPOA or the nuclear agreement. But the public knows about these groups now. Iranian Americans are aware of what they've been doing, and they've been informing members of Congress and others in the US government. Unfortunately, the US media still cites a number of these individuals and groups, and they get invited to conferences and seminars in the United States. They write for very high-profile publications like Foreign Affairs, which has, for whatever reason, become a big platform for these individuals. And they're very active in Europe as well. So these lobbies and networks have not given up on the Islamic Republic. They're still pushing for the JCPOA, and everybody needs to be made aware of what they're doing. They hide behind being anti-war and lie to the public and say that the JCPOA is preventing war, and they've been doing this for years. Iranian Americans and our allies are very much aware of these groups. I'm sure a lot of your audience members know them very well, but I think the wider public, especially the media, should also be made aware of their activities.
Alireza Nader, thank you very much for appearing with us today. And thanks to our audience. We had a whole bunch of questions. I wish I could have gotten to more. And join us down the road next week for more webinars. Appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.